Every fan of Star Trek knows that Star Trek continuity is a bit messy at times, and in several significant ways. Some fans can be rather persnickety about canon and quite vocal when they spot an error, and there have been some doozies over the years. I used to be quite bothered by a few significant errors, and frankly, some of them still annoy me. However, I've come up with a fix that, at least in my own mind, fixes a lot of these continuity errors and enhances my enjoyment of Star Trek. And I want to share this idea with my fellow Trekkies. To fully explain my idea, I need to lay some groundwork, so please stick around to the end of the video so I can tie all these pieces together and present my case in its entirety. Before I begin, let's take a moment to consider how much Star Trek actually exists. It first aired in 1966, and here we are, about 60 years later. Trek has 13 feature films, a made-for-streaming movie, 3 animated shows, 10 live-action shows including short treks and the upcoming Starfleet Academy show. That's approximately 1,000 episodes of TV. New Star Trek movies and episodes have been produced in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s. That's 7 decades. With all that content, and for the record, I've seen every second of it multiple times because I'm that dedicated of a nerd, expecting zero continuity contradictions would be unrealistic. As a matter of fact, I want to applaud the hundreds of creative people that pieced all this together over the decades. I think Trekkies should be, and for the most part are, very appreciative of all of their work. Now let me present my case. I'd like to start by discussing a continuity problem created by that longevity of Star Trek. The real world has created one of the most significant continuity problems, and that's the eugenics wars. It was initially established by the original series in The Wrath of Khan as having happened in the 1990s. Well, there never were any eugenics wars in the real 1990s. The eugenics wars have been retconned by Star Trek Strange New Worlds to occur sometime in the early 21st century, connecting them to a Second American Civil War and World War III. Even with this retcon, the real-world timeline isn't quite reconcilable with the Star Trek timeline. What are we fans to do with that? Other serious continuity errors occurred in Star Trek because the writers chose to ignore certain events, or because the contradiction was not caught in time, or the writers just thought their story was more important than adhering to canon. For example, Jean-Luc Picard stated that first contact with the Klingons went so badly that it sparked a war, and subsequently new protocols for first contact were established. However, in the pilot episode of Star Trek Enterprise Broken Bow, first contact with humans and Klingons did not go the way Picard described. It was rocky, but it did not start a war. Oops. The physical appearance of the Klingons is another significant continuity problem. Klingons had flat foreheads in the original series. They had head ridges in the motion picture because Paramount had a larger budget than the TV show, and director Robert Wise wanted the Klingons to have a more alien look. The writers came up with a neat canon fix in Star Trek Enterprise's 4th season, but then Star Trek Discovery came along and the Klingons not only had head ridges again, but they looked even more alien than they did before. I'm with most fans here. I dislike the look of the Star Trek Discovery Klingons, especially because it creates a continuity problem that had already been fixed. They broke something that had already been repaired. Another continuity problem arose when Scotty awoke in the 24th century. In the Next Generation episode Relics, he mentions Jim Kirk as if he were still alive. But in Star Trek Generations, Kirk was lost on the maiden voyage of the Enterprise B. Scotty saw it happen, thus Scotty should not have mentioned Kirk as being still alive. Oops. Another blaring contradiction is the physical appearance of the USS Enterprise in the series Strange New Worlds versus the original series. Strange New Worlds is supposed to take place after the pilot episode The Cage, but a few years before Kirk took command of the ship. The USS Enterprise in uniforms look nothing like they did in The Cage, and are way more modern looking than in the Man Trap. Personally, I love the look of Strange New Worlds Enterprise, but it creates an undeniable visual inconsistency. The producers are adamant that this is the prime universe of the original series and the Next Generation films. If that's the case, what are we fans to make of these visual discrepancies? Shifting from plot inconsistencies, let's talk about the varying time travel rules depicted in Star Trek. While a multiverse exists, time travel usually only impacts a single quantum reality. There is one prime universe timeline, and if something in the past changes, it alters that specific timeline rendering the first timeline non-existent, like overwriting a computer's hard drive. A primary example of this is the Next Generation episode Yesterday's Enterprise. In that fantastic episode, the Enterprise we knew and loved was replaced by a dystopian battleship Enterprise fighting a devastating war against the Klingons. That happened because something changed in the past, creating a new timeline that erased the old timeline. When the past gets repaired, the timeline returns to normal. But that's not quite 100% correct, is it? Things didn't really go back to normal exactly. Tasha Yar, having gone back in time with the doomed Enterprise C, ended up having a Romulan daughter in the past. This half-Romulan, half-human woman would become an adversary in later episodes. This means that the timeline was not restored at the end of the show Yesterday's Enterprise, but a new timeline was created instead. The rules of time travel were depicted quite differently in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek film. When I left the theater in 2009, the nerd that I am, I was quite upset that the original Spock going back in time, and with Vulcan getting destroyed, I thought that this meant that they had wiped the previous Star Trek canon from existence, kind of like what happened in Yesterday's Enterprise, sort of like Marty's family photo in Back to the Future. However, when the show Star Trek Picard premiered, we saw events that were set after the Romulan supernova event of the 2009 Star Trek film. It became clear that Spock and the Romulan mining ship's time travel did not erase the original timeline from existence, it created an alternate parallel universe. Instead of overwriting the metaphorical hard drive, it copied it and then added new software. This was a distinctly different way of looking at time travel, and it is now part of the established canon of Star Trek in both the Kelvin and Prime timelines. Time travel can create an alternate timeline without erasing the old one. To simplify that, time travel in Star Trek can either replace a timeline or create a new parallel timeline, and perhaps that is dependent upon the method of going back in time, or maybe how significant of a change occurs in the past. There is a case to be made that any time time travel occurs in Star Trek, it almost never erases the previous universe, but rather creates a new parallel timeline. Star Trek Picard was the first time we saw the continuation of a timeline after a time travel event altered the past. Why not extrapolate that into other time travel events? This will be the basis of my canon fix, but it requires a little more explanation. The idea for my continuity fix started to form in my mind when I saw Guinan in Los Angeles in 2024 during the second season of Star Trek Picard. I was at first annoyed that Guinan didn't recognize Picard in the 21st century because she had already met him in the 19th century, the Mark Twain two-parter Next Generation episode. At first, I thought it was another aggravating mistake, and it made me mad, but then it occurred to me that it was actually very correct that Guinan didn't recognize Picard. Because, in that season of Star Trek Picard, Q sent Picard to an alternate dystopian version of the late 24th century. It was a universe where the Federation never existed. The absence of a Federation in that Q-made existence means that the Enterprise D could not have traveled back to the 19th century for Picard to meet Guinan because it didn't exist to do so. As complicated as that sounds, and it's something that would give Captain Janeway a headache, it actually makes logical sense. If you travel back in time from an alternate reality, you will be in the past of that alternate reality, creating yet another timeline. Now let's talk about some time travel fixes that happen to supposedly correct a timeline, which is also essential to my canon fix theory. The one that comes to most people's mind would probably be Star Trek First Contact. The Borg attacked Earth, and when Starfleet fends off the cube, the Borg launched a sphere. That sphere went back to prevent first contact with the Vulcans. To that end, the sphere fires weapons at the surface of Earth, killing several people at the warp site in Montana. The Enterprise E followed the Borg back in time to help Cochrane fix his damaged warp ship, allowing him to make his first warp flight and attract the attention of the Vulcans. At the end of the movie, Picard says, "Laying a course for the 24th century? I suspect our future will be there waiting for us." However, they didn't quite return to the same reality because despite the crew's best efforts, significant changes had already been made to the timeline. This means that Star Trek Insurrection and Star Trek Nemesis take place in a slightly altered universe. I think it is reasonable to conclude that timelines don't get erased each time somebody travels through time, but an alternate reality is created because no matter how minimal the interaction is in the past, changes occur. Before I go on, let's pause for a second to talk about quantum signatures. If I am proposing a canon fix, I can't ignore canon to do so. It is established canon that every separate reality in the multiverse has a distinct quantum signature. Well, what a quantum signature is exactly is not fully explained, so there is some wiggle room here. What if a new timeline universe that is so close to the original universe has the same quantum signature, or a signature that is so similar that it's undetectable by 24th century technology? Star Trek writers like to use analogies to explain technobabble, so here's my analogy. Instead of the timeline changes being separate highways with different road signs, they are separate lanes on the same highway with the same road signs, meaning the same quantum signature, separate yet moving in the same direction. They might all even merge together into a single lane if you drive far enough ahead on the highway. The exit ramps would lead to alternate roads with alternate signs. The quantum signatures would likely be the same because they branched off of the same quantum reality. Get it? Let's go back to how this can fix Star Trek canon. There is a Borg episode of Star Trek Enterprise called Regeneration. It shows Arctic researchers finding Borg drones frozen in the ice. Once thawed, the drones assimilate the humans and launch into space. Captain Archer and crew have to go off and stop them. These events are inarguably something that occurred as a direct result of the movie Star Trek First Contact. That means that the entirety of the show Star Trek Enterprise takes place in an alternate timeline from previous on-screen Star Trek. Star Trek Enterprise is not part of the original timeline due to the Borg time travel attack, as evidenced by the Borg episode of Enterprise. It is inarguable. The show is in a different lane of that metaphorical highway and would have the same quantum signature because it originated from the same universe. There is no reason to think that quantum signature would change just because a new branch went off of that reality. Here is my proposed solution, and then I will provide supporting arguments to justify it. Almost all canon mistakes can be reconciled and therefore are not truly inconsistent after all. I say that whenever something is presented on screen that contradicts something from before, it means that we are now witnessing a new timeline. Seemingly contradictory things become the new reality. In other words, if something contradicts what happened before, that means that it was in a different parallel reality caused by some time travel incident. The Department of Temporal Investigations has its work cut out for them. Let's use the Enterprise NX-01 to argue the point and demonstrate how this works. Before the show Star Trek Enterprise existed, there was no mention of that version of the Enterprise, something fans complained about when the show was new. In the real world, the simple answer is that, the show didn't exist yet, so they obviously couldn't show you things from a show that didn't exist. But how do we reconcile that? Well, some people have tried to excuse the inconsistency away by saying that it just never came up in conversation between characters, or they point out it was a pre-Federation starship, it wasn't a USS Enterprise, it was just Enterprise. But I don't think those fixes really work. Didn't really satisfy that inconsistency very well. The Enterprise D and E both displayed past versions of the Enterprise, but the NX-01 was not among the models. We saw a US Navy Enterprise, but no NX-01 Enterprise. In Star Trek the Motion Picture, the recreation deck showed past Enterprises. Logically, if there had been an NX-01 Enterprise in that universe, it should have been displayed there because it was a historically significant ship of the same name. I submit that the reason the NX-01 wasn't there is because before the Borg time travel attack on Montana, there was no Enterprise NX-01 in existence for their historical timeline. That's not as crazy as it might initially sound. It was established in Enterprise's Borg episode Regeneration that Zefram Cochrane discussed his experiences with the Borg. Captain Archer said that Cochrane once gave a commencement address in which he told the story about cyborgs from the future, but later recanted. Perhaps the original timeline version of Zefram Cochrane, the one who never met Riker or Troy, had initially suggested that the first Warp 5 ship be called the Yorktown or Columbia, or any number of other names, or maybe he didn't give an opinion at all. However, after the events of Star Trek First Contact, where the Enterprise crew saved his warp ship, he changed his mind and suggested that Enterprise be the name of the future NX project, and he might have suggested that name to his friend Henry Archer. In other words, NX-01 Enterprise was named after Picard's Enterprise, whereas it had a different name in the original universe. That simple thing resolves this continuity problem rather neatly. It also resolves the continuity issue of Cochrane meeting James Kirk in the episode Metamorphosis. Cochrane would likely have reacted to hearing Kirk mention the name Enterprise if he was the same Cochrane from the timeline of the Borg attack, but he clearly wasn't because Star Trek First Contact hadn't happened yet. This means that the original series is clearly in a different universe from Star Trek Enterprise. It is also a different universe from post-First Contact movies like Insurrection and Nemesis. See how this works? Strange New Worlds mentions the NX-01 Enterprise on screen, so we can place that in the reality created by the Borg attack. Let's examine the continuity problems I addressed earlier. The eugenics wars were retconned in Strange New Worlds Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. In the 21st century, a time-traveling Romulan was attempting to slow human progress so that the Federation would be less of a threat to the Romulans in the future. This episode shows Khan as a kid in the 21st century. It was mentioned on screen that all of this was supposed to happen in 1992 by the Romulan agent. This means that it is now official Star Trek canon that Strange New Worlds is in a different reality from the original series and the Wrath of Khan. The same war cannot happen in two different centuries. Those two versions of the eugenics wars may have unfolded in extremely similar ways, but they are distinct and different and happened in separate realities. The timeline has changed and a new universe has been created, a new branch from the original quantum reality. Strange New Worlds is a parallel reality from the original series created by more than one time travel incident, different lanes on the same highway. The Romulan incursion in Strange New Worlds can easily explain away the distinct look of the Enterprise compared to the original series. Technology and aesthetic designs develop differently in those slightly different universe branches. What about Captain Picard getting the details of First Contact with the Klingons wrong? Well, when he said that in The Next Generation, the events of the movie First Contact hadn't happened yet. Therefore, the events of Star Trek Enterprise would have unfolded differently, and the First Contact with the Klingons would have occurred differently as well. Those two things are not contradictory because they are in different realities. Or it could be that Picard of The Next Generation was in a timeline before the Temporal Cold War, and it was because of that Temporal Cold War that the Klingon went to Broken Bow, Oklahoma in the first place, altering the reality of Star Trek Enterprise and when humans met Klingons for the first time. So those things are not contradictory, they just happened in different timelines. It was also said by Daniels that history has no mention of the Xindi attack on Earth. This means that everything that happened after the Star Trek Enterprise Xindi story arc was also in a different reality, separate from the others. New timeline universes are being created all over the place in Star Trek. Timelines don't get erased as implied in yesterday's Enterprise, at least not every time. The multiverse just gets bigger. Every time Star Trek characters travel into the past and return, they find themselves in a slightly altered branch of the single quantum reality, even if everything appears to be the same. Those changes can sometimes have unexpected consequences, even if we don't see them on screen. I submit that whatever the most recent show or movie is actually the newest version of the Prime Universe, the newest branch of that quantum reality. If something from past shows or films seems to be contradictory, they weren't. They were correct from those perspectives, but have changed with the new reality, with the new slightly altered timeline. Another continuity discrepancy that can be resolved is that of Picard's mother. In The Next Generation, we see a Picard who recognizes his mom as an older woman. In the show Picard, we see her as someone who took her own life when Picard was a child. How many time travel incidents have there been between those two apparent contradictions? Plenty. Who knows what small event in the past changed her fate? Maybe the ancestor of a therapist who would have helped her was killed in the Borg attack. There are a number of different things that could have happened to alter that. This theory explains why characters in Lower Decks, a newer show, are familiar with the Enterprise as it appeared in Strange New Worlds rather than the original series. Star Trek Picard took place after the Romulan supernova and Spock's travel into the past in the 2009 Star Trek film. This means that we know it is canon that time travel can create an alternate reality without erasing the old reality. Extrapolate that out further. Starfleet has hundreds, if not thousands of ships. How many timeline incursions have happened that we don't even know about? I say that if you think of Star Trek this way, there are almost no continuity contradictions at all. We are looking at a multiverse where each time characters come back from the past, they inhabit a slightly altered reality, a different branch off of that quantum reality. And because we know that alternate realities exist, we can rest assured that no continuity that we love has been erased. We're just witnessing new timeline universes as they happen. The original Spock from the 1966 show still exists, but in a different universe from the Spock we see in the 2020s Strange New Worlds. The Prime timeline follows the events of the shows and movies as they are presented in release order. This makes for a more fun viewing experience than getting frustrated by canon errors. How many seemingly contradictory things can be fixed by thinking of Star Trek this way? I contend that almost all of them can be. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share them in the comments. And if you think my theory is interesting, please share this video. Thank you for watching my channel and live long and prosper.